Welcome, everyone. Well, it's interesting to be here at a time where Taiwan's not the one causing all the headlines. It's actually Hong Kong this morning. That's keeping everyone busy. But I appreciate you coming out with what's turning out to be really a year-long celebration of the Taiwan Relations Act and looking at all its various aspects and what we can do in Washington to continue to support it and make the most of it. Today, what we wanted to do is take a step back and look at where things are in US-Taiwan relations, especially in light of the TRA, and to see where we're headed in the relationship. We're very pleased and honored to help us do that. We have with us Dr. Szu-chien, Deputy Minister for Foreign Affairs, a post he's held since July 2018. Previously, Szu-chien was president of the Taiwan Foundation for Democracy. He was there for 2 years where we worked together. In fact, we just did a program last year together while you were still there. Before that, he was Associate Research Fellow at Academia Sinica in Taipei from 2003 to 2017. Dr. Szu received his BA in Political Science from National Taiwan University and an MA and PhD in Political Science from Columbia University. So with that, I'm just going to turn it over to Szu-chien. He'll get us started, and then we're going to do this a little bit differently in the panel discussions, and I'll point that out when we get there. But with no further ado, let me turn it over to the Deputy Foreign Minister.
Director Lohman, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. It is an honor and a pleasure to attend today's seminar on Taiwan-US relations. I would like to thank Director Lohman and the Heritage Foundation to invite me to deliver a speech here. I always feel intellectually thrilled to have the chance to be enlightened by different opinions from discussions and debates with friends and partners in Washington, D.C. I very much cherish this opportunity to exchange views on the current state and the future outlook for the Taiwan-US partnership, particularly against the fast-changing US-China relations. This year marks the 40th anniversary of the enactment of the Taiwan Relations Act. To commemorate this milestone, we have already held several events with the Heritage Foundation over the past few months. In January, Dr. Edwin Fuller took part in an event in Taipei, co-hosted with the Zhonghua Institute for Economic Research, to mark the release of the Heritage Foundation's latest Economic Freedom Report, as well as to explore ways of deepening economic and trade ties between Taiwan and US, and accelerating Taiwan's integration in the regional economy. When President Tsai Ing-wen made a stopover in Hawaii in March, we also conducted a very informative video conference. And today we have gathered for another round of wide-ranging discussion on our bilateral ties. So once again, I want to express my gratitude to the Heritage Foundation for its long-standing interest in and cooperation with Taiwan. Your support for the country and the Taiwan-US partnership is deeply appreciated. The purpose of the TRA was to define the framework of US-Taiwan interactions following the change of diplomatic recognition. It paved the way for vibrant and substantive bilateral exchanges, and has helped ensure that Taiwan has the capabilities necessary to defend itself. The TRA was critical in creating an environment in which Taiwan could fully devote itself to political and economic development. Through the unwavering efforts of our people and the conditions set by the TRA, Taiwan moved away from an authoritarian system of government to become a beacon of freedom and democracy in Asia. In fact, Taiwan ranked the 10th in the 2019 Index of Economic Freedom reported by the Heritage Foundation, and the 26th in the 2019 Freedom of the World reported by Freedom House. And from being a recipient of foreign aid, Taiwan has evolved into a donor of international assistance. Today, Taiwan-US relations are stronger than ever before. Mutual interaction between high-level officials are close and frequent. Vice President Mike Pence and Secretary of State Mike Pompeo have publicly praised Taiwan's democratic accomplishments and the free economy. And the U.S. Congress has repeatedly shown its staunch support for Taiwan by passing legislation in favor of our country, such as Taiwan Travel Act and the Taiwan Assurance Act, which was recently passed by the House of Representatives. 2 weeks ago, at the 18th Asia Security Summit in Singapore, or the Shangri-La Dialogue, Acting Secretary of Defense Patrick Shanahan reiterated that the U.S. continues to meet obligations under the TRA to deliver articles and services for Taiwan's self-defense. The Trump administration has announced 3 arms sales to Taiwan so far, and also approved marketing licenses enabling U.S. manufacturers to assist Taiwan with our indigenous submarine program. All of these have delivered a considerable boost to our defense capabilities. Economic and trade ties remain strong as well. Taiwan is the 11th largest U.S. trading partner and the 8th largest export market for U.S. agricultural products. Major technology companies such as Google, Facebook, Microsoft, and Micron have expanded investments in Taiwan recently. And very importantly as well, our 2 countries have made great progress in cultural and educational cooperation. The results of the State Department's Fulbright program have been excellent. Newly launched programs in recent years, such as English Teaching Assistantships, ETA, have further bolstered our exchanges. The State Department has also worked with us on the implementation of the Critical Language Scholarships Program, CLS program, in Taiwan, to the benefit of U.S. undergraduate and graduate students. Just last Thursday, the counterpart of AIT in Taipei, in Taiwan, the Coordination Council for North American Affairs, CCNAA, has been renamed the Taiwan Council for U.S. Affairs, TCUSA. The renaming not only better represents the nature of the agency, but also reflects the growing mutual trust between our 2 countries. The friendship between Taiwan and the U.S. is very much a forward-looking one. Our ongoing endeavors are geared toward building a better future for our 2 peoples and for the entire region. Our common aspirations for what lies ahead are underpinned by shared values of freedom, democracy, and rule of law, and human rights, as well as the general belief that the free and open Indo-Pacific is fundamental to the peace and prosperity of the region and the world. The faithful implementation of the TRA over the past 40 years by administration from both major U.S. parties clearly underlines the peace, security, and stability in the Indo-Pacific are core interests of the United States. The Indo-Pacific strategy has further solidified the U.S. role in the region and contributed to the forming a grand coalition of like-minded countries to jointly advance these common aspirations and shared values. The U.S. government has clearly stated that the Indo-Pacific strategy is committed to a region where all nations are sovereign, strong, and prosperous, trade is free, fair, and reciprocal. Good governance and robust civil societies safeguard political and economic rights. And a dynamic private sector facilitates thriving business and investment. Acting Secretary Shanahan has stated in the Shangri-La Dialogue that every nation, independent of size, has an important role to play and has a responsibility in the free and open Indo-Pacific. Taiwan seeks to play a key part in such a picture. That is why we have made a comprehensive effort to strengthen our engagement with the region. Our new southbound policy, which President Tsai implemented after taking office in 2016, is an excellent demonstration of our determination. It was actually initiated before the Indo-Pacific strategy was promulgated. But from a hindsight, the new southbound policy reflects the strategic foresight of the Tsai administration. Under this policy, Taiwan has bolstered economic and commercial linkages with South and Southeast Asia, as well as with Australia and New Zealand. We have also enhanced exchanges in fields such as culture, education, tourism, medical services, and public health. Taiwanese businesses, which have operated in these countries for decades, are upgrading their industrial clusters there. And through migration flows, our society now boasts many people who have strong connections to these countries, which has given us another advantage in building networks and fostering mutually beneficial ties. The new southbound policy is thus complementary with the Indo-Pacific strategy. Taiwanese and U.S. interests align closely, and we should fully exploit existing synergies so that we both benefit from the high economic growth in the region. Our close cooperation will also contribute to fortifying a robust, rules-based economic order. Meanwhile, Taiwan has allocated $3.5 billion to Official Development Assistance, ODA, in support of infrastructure and development programs in neighboring countries and intensified collaborations with the U.S. Overseas Private Investment Corporation, OPIC. Moreover, we have worked in close coordination with the United States to promote our shared values in the region. Last March, we hosted the first regional civil society dialogue on securing religious freedom with the presence of the U.S. Ambassador at Large for International Religious Freedom, Mr. Sam Brownback. Furthermore, our two countries have jointly carried out projects under the Global Cooperation and Training Framework, GCTF, related to issues ranging from women's empowerment, media literacy, public health, cybersecurity, and environment protection to humanitarian assistance and disaster relief. And we have launched the Indo-Pacific Democratic Governance Consultations to advance good governance and human rights in the region. What we have achieved exactly demonstrates that the enduring partnership between U.S. and Taiwan is a unique and indispensable asset to the region. Our joint efforts in the Indo-Pacific are meant to safeguard the international order that has been cultivated over many decades. This is necessary because challenges have emerged to this order. Authoritarian regimes have eroded and disrupted global freedom in recent years. As pointed out by the U.S. National Security Strategy, these regimes are using technology, propaganda, corruption, and coercion to create a world antithetical to the principles and the values that we uphold. As in the front line of the authoritarian offense, Taiwan has experienced acute threats to our democracy. On January 2nd this year, Chinese President Xi Jinping delivered a speech in which he sought to impose a Taiwanese version of the one country, two system formula on Taiwan, and made a point of not renouncing the use of force against Taiwan. In fact, China has lured away some of our diplomatic allies, blocked our international participation, pressured transnational enterprises to downgrade or change the designation for Taiwan, and dispatched military aircrafts and naval vessels to circle Taiwan. President Tsai Ing-wen has repeatedly stressed that although Taiwan does not seek to provoke, we shall not bow under any pressure either. Taiwan will do all it can to protect and strengthen its international position and defend itself against any threat of its sovereignty. But make no mistake, China's ambition extends beyond Taiwan. China has sought to impose its values and system across the region, as well as stretching to other continents. By taking advantage of its abundance of human resources, states' monopoly of financial and strategic sectors, and its entry into World Trade Organization, China has enjoyed high growth rate for 3 decades. Along with its economic takeoff, China has also developed a party-state capitalism for its economic expansion. Equipped with such an idiosyncratic economic system, China has resorted to stealing technological and commercial secrets, as well as intellectual property, and sought to upend existing mechanisms to retain a leading position in preparation for looming technology battles, and transform those technologies from time to time into military advantages. In interactions with other countries, China has leveraged economic sanctions, military bullying, and sharp power to force them to acquiesce to its demands. It has also engaged in the disinformation campaign to influence democratic processes. Militarily, China is intent on breaking through the first island chain. In the South China Sea, the scope of China's land reclamation projects has far surpassed similar efforts by all other claimants combined. And China has used its Belt and Road Initiative to obtain control over key ports worldwide. Its global strategic ambitions are very evident. In this light, we commend the efforts of the Trump administration in taking concrete actions to rectify those economic behaviors of China that deviate from the global norms. Indeed, the strong measures adopted by the Trump administration vis-à-vis China has enjoyed bipartisan support in the US and been widely endorsed by policymaking circles. For example, the Asian Society presented a report in February authored by 17 experts suggesting that President Trump adopt exactly such a stance. In addition, Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer and House Speaker Nancy Pelosi have also backed the administration's decision to impose punitive tariffs on China and stated that the U.S. should not retreat from its position. I suppose if we want to use an analogy, we could say that U.S.-China relationship has caught a cold, like what I do today, and it's suffering from a fever. The current trade negotiations, which are part of the prolonged process of recalibrate the relationship, could, of course, be directed toward administering medicine that instantly eases some of the pain and temporarily appeases key stakeholders. But President Trump has been resolute in his desire to identify a long-term solution that addresses the root causes, such as China's unfair treatment of foreign enterprises, its intellectual property theft, coerced technological transfer, and its vacillating attitude toward carrying out structural reforms. If successful, this approach will go a long way in reaffirming the primacy of the rules-based trade order in the Indo-Pacific and around the world. From such a perspective, these measures should not be deemed as blocking China's rise, but a bitter process to bring China back to the right track that will benefit not only the world but also the Chinese people in the long run. Taiwan is making sure that it is well positioned for recalibrated US-China relations. Many Taiwanese enterprises are redirecting investments to Taiwan and diversifying their deployment across the region, which dovetails with our new southbound policy and reduces our past over-reliance on the Chinese market. In our economic engagement with US as well as other countries, we are devoted to ensuring market access, protecting intellectual property, and fostering a fair and reciprocal trading system. We look forward to the constructive talks with the US on economic issues of mutual interest and hope to enter into negotiations such as free trade agreement. I'm confident that such an agreement would deliver substantial benefits to both sides and serve as a model for the entire Indo-Pacific. Once again, I would like to thank you for inviting me to speak here today. Taiwan is fully committed to deepening substantive relations with the United States. By cooperating closely in all domains, we can jointly overcome current challenges and build an Indo-Pacific that adheres to the values and the principles we hold so dear together. Thank you.
Well, I've never seen a Taiwan audience that didn't have a lot of questions. But while you think about them just for a moment, I have one that I wanted to ask you. One of the areas that the Trump administration has been trying to work more than previous ones on with regard to Taiwan's international space is its allies, trying to help it preserve its allies. We're in a tricky situation given that we also don't recognize Taiwan, right? So it's hard. It's a difficult case to make. So I wanted to ask you, how does Taiwan now see the importance of those diplomatic allies as they dwindle? How important is it that Taiwan keep them? And I don't say that prejudicing any outcome because I think it does have to be kept in some perspective. The relationship you get with the United States and Japan and Australia in many ways is bigger than what you have with some of the smaller ones that are actually diplomatic allies, right? So I don't say that prejudicing either side of it. I'd just like to get an idea from you where this fits in Taiwan's overall priority list on foreign relations.
So, before I answer your question, I wonder if I can have one of those bottles of water. Thank you very much. Thank you. Let me have some water before I answer. Yes, as you mentioned when you introduced me to the audience, I came to work at the MOFA since last July, and it has been around a year. And my minister gave me a big portfolio covering North America and Asia Pacific. By saying Asia Pacific includes South Asia, Southeast Asia, Northeast Asia, and the Pacific. And in the Pacific, Taiwan has 6 allies. So let me tell you the truth. Every evening, I have to read the cables about these 6 allies before I sleep. Otherwise, I won't be able to sleep. And sometimes after reading, I don't sleep well either. These allies are extremely important to Taiwan, extremely important. I have such a big portfolio, but I take it as the priority of my job. I can't tell you exact number, but I have made multiple trips to the Pacific. Sometimes it's short notice to those countries, but I'm ready to make my trip whenever it's necessary. And we have devoted a lot of resources and commitment to defending our allies, not only in the Pacific, but also in Caribbean and Latin America, as well as in Africa and Europe. So they speak for Taiwan on various international forums and occasions. They defend Taiwan's rights to participate in various international spaces, and they condemn the bullying and coercion exerted to Taiwan. So we cherish their friendship, and we are very committed to maintain each single relationship with our allies.
Okay, questions from the audience? Yeah, right down in front here.
Dr. Loman, I'd like to follow
We got a
up on
microphone.
your question.
We got a microphone for you. Please identify yourself if you wouldn't mind.
Timothy Towell, a former U.S. diplomat starting in the Kennedy administration. I would like to follow up on Dr. Loman's brilliant question on what you and your government are doing to maintain your allies against the communist Chinese energy in the world to take everything away from you guys and isolate you. And I'm delighted, I took notes on the positive activities you're doing in Asia, but I spent most of my career in Africa and South America, where the PRC is vigorously advancing their national interests, lying to foreign sovereign countries to get them to dump you. And you're now down, I think, to about 17 countries. I used to be ambassador in Paraguay. The Paraguayans ask me now, I'm retired, of course, you know, whether the United States or whether the Taiwan think it's really important to maintain these things. What do I say to my Latin American and African friends about blocking aggressive Chinese, PRC, and staying with their allies and friends of the past?
So I think part of the point of that is what are you doing specifically to keep your alliances?
Thank you for that question, for giving me an opportunity to briefly explain what Taiwan has been doing for our allies and what to tell them. It has to do what we do and what China does in various countries. Usually, when we build diplomatic relations with a country, there are several things we do for them. We do for their people, not only for the government or politicians, mainly for the people, including usually we have a Taiwan Technology Mission, TTM, which focuses on smart culture. Smart agriculture, or fishery or aquaculture. And we also have a team to help those countries to advance their public health services, mainly stationed in their central hospital or national hospital. And we also have programs to provide scholarships for young men and women to come to Taiwan to study. And on top of that, usually sometimes we also have programs for clean energy, such as solar energy, solar pack. And and then it differs from country to country. For some country, we have some specific projects. And these are all long-term projects. And on top of that, for specific needs, for example, in certain country, if they want to build a Congress building or a parliamentary building, or they want to renovate their government building, we are also willing to help. And recently, when President Tsai traveled to some of our Pacific allies, she also signed the maritime patrol agreements with them and donate one patrol boat to each country, which were made in Taiwan. And we would like them to advance their capabilities of maritime patrol. So these are the things we do for our allies. And China is good at build a huge project at one shot, but usually those are done with business interest rate loan. And sometimes it turns out to be the white elephant projects, such as the conference center in Vanuatu. Now it cannot be used because it's leaking. And it's too expensive to maintain. So it's useless right now. But they have to pay the debt. So a lot of these things happened. So actually, in some of my recent experience, defending our diplomatic relations in one of the Pacific countries, I don't want to name which one, but the experience was that the media, especially the radio station in those countries, had spread it around the message of the debt trap and the white elephant project. So the public opinion are fully aware of those risks. And that has, I believe, very deep impact on the decision of the politicians, whether to change their diplomatic relations. Thank you.
Right here in the center.
Yes, I'm Russell King, retired federal employee. A little follow-up on the last few questions. China is active at maritime strategic choke points like Bab el-Mandeb. I believe they're active in Djibouti, and it has to do with the passage between the Mediterranean and the Indian Ocean. Also, I believe in Gwadar, Pakistan. I think they've had a listening post for shipping going through the Straits of Hormuz. And of course, they have a big resource relationship with Africa, where I believe your only diplomatic ally is Eswatini right now, maybe. But can you, I was wondering if you could tell me a little bit about the transnational movement of goods from the Middle East and African region to the Pacific, and what China is doing and what you would do to improve that situation. And I would think that India would be a good diplomatic partner for you because of China's collusive actions with Pakistan.
Yes, India is a like-minded country, and we have also tried very hard to advance our relationship with India. But India is also an ancient civilization. When it comes to their diplomatic strategy, there are many layers of thinking of India, and we have to understand it that way. And then that multiple layer of thinking is reflected in their behaviors too. So at this point, I think we have a great opportunity to advance our economic and technological cooperation relationship with India. That's also what they are interested in. Particularly when Modi got re-elected, I think he will devoted a lot of energy in shrinking the income gap domestically. And so there are many projects, small projects that can benefit directly the ordinary people. I think Taiwan can be of much help. But geopolitically, I don't think Taiwan has that kind of ambition or capability. our defense capability, our indigenous defense capability right now are mostly devoted to defend ourselves from possible invasion, mainly coming from China. As for the remote possibility of cooperation, such as in Indian Ocean or South China Sea, we do have existence in South China Sea or Taiping Island there, but we don't want to follow China's path to militarize the island. We would like to turn it as a place for ecological and environmental protection studies or tourism. But unfortunately, because of China's militarization of those islands, there's a trend that other countries may follow suit. This is very unfortunate. And we understand that the code of conduct is being negotiated among the ASEAN countries and China, and we hope it will turn out to be a rules-based one with a mechanism of enforcement and having countries contribute to that agreement with responsibility. Otherwise, it's empty. So we endorse. I think what Taiwan can do is to endorse and subscribe to the rules-based order, because that's also what many countries want. We want to be in line with them, and as I said, Taiwan doesn't have the geopolitical ambition to compete with China, and it's not our capacity either. But we want everyone to bring China back, as I said in my speech, bring China back to a rules-based order. I think that will benefit everyone and benefit China in the long run.
I'm going to remember that explanation about India's behavior. I'm going to file it away, so next time I'm pulling my hair out over something the Indians did, I'm going to go back and think about their ancient civilization and their layers of decision-making, et cetera. Okay, other questions? Yeah, go ahead. We got a microphone for you.
Scott Harold from the RAND Corporation. It's good to see you, Szu-chien. I wonder if you could give us a sense of the level of threat that China poses to Taiwan's democracy through its use of social media to manipulate Taiwan society, Taiwan public opinion, and its ability to promote certain candidates or certain trends in Taiwan society that may be divisive, and what steps your government is taking to counter that.
Thank you, Scott, for that very important question. Yes, there is a serious threat to Taiwan's democracy. I also mentioned that in my speech. And I think our government is taking that very, very seriously. There are multiple mechanisms of coordination among government agencies to address this challenge. Let me mention a few cases of the threat in the concrete context. Last year we had this local election, last November, I believe. Some of the candidates, again, don't make me name names, their popularity has been boosted in a very short period of time on the social media, and that was reflected in the mainstream media, which I believe helped him get elected. Help that candidate get elected. And later on, studies found that a lot of this popularity came from bots. If you trace those bots, their IP address changes every day. One day is in maybe Romania, next day is in Malaysia, and the third day is in Latin America. These are bots, a lot of them. So gradually, I think one way to deal with that, of course, you can say that our government can deal with those social media companies. I think our government has been doing that, but it takes time. These companies, I believe you all know better than I do, are difficult to deal with. And no single country government is able to dominate or tell them what exactly not to do. But to different degree, different companies are willing to at least work together with our government in a certain sense. So we do have some progresses in that. And that's one thing. Another thing is our legislature right now is considering a legislation or multiple legislations to regulate the dissemination of this information. But again, this is politically extremely difficult because once you talk about that, then the opposition will come up to accuse the government, infringing their freedom of speech and their freedom of criticizing the government. And sometimes the opposition say the government itself is the source of this information. You have this political battle all the time. And this is a process for democracy, but I think there are serious consideration in the legislative yuan about some legislation. And I also think learning from the example of other countries, this is also very, very necessary. It's June right now, but to some extent we have already stepped into the campaign hot season. And right now it's in the process of intra-party primary, so to speak, primary. And we already have witnessed some other kinds of disinformation. So disinformation actually, like what it does in many other countries, plays right into the most divisive and controversial policy issues. And they amplify the opposition among different camps, not only on the social media or internet, but also on the streets. I think the difference of China's political warfare from other authoritarian regime is that they have this united front warfare. United front meaning you have to unite your secondary enemy to fight collectively to fight your first enemy, the most important enemy. So the Chinese Communist Party is good at making alignment or a coalition with the lesser enemies and to fight against the major enemy, which means they build coalitions in Taiwan. While some people also call it the fifth column elements, the same. There are groups, social groups or political parties, small political parties that echo Beijing's line, and they don't hesitate to take actions, confrontational actions on the streets whenever there's a demonstration. So this further complicates the situation, and the coalition network they built within Taiwan society, they penetrate very deeply into Taiwan society. They have the welcome delegation to visit China with their united front warfare system, and to invite delegation from even elementary school or neighborhood organization. Of course, these kind of political warfare measures is mixed with regular exchanges. I think our government does not ban or forbid any regular exchanges, but there are activities organized by the United Front systems of Chinese Communist Party. So that's another challenge. We have to distinguish between them. Thank you.
Thank you. We could stay here the rest of the afternoon asking you questions, I think, but I think you actually have to go. So please join me in thanking the Deputy Foreign Minister for his remarks.
Thank you.
Very good to see you.
Thank you.
Okay,
Thank you
good
very
luck to
much.
you.
Thank
Good luck.
you.
We'll see you around.
Okay.
Okay, I'm going to call up the first panel. While I'm waiting for folks to come up here, Riley, I'm not sure, there's Riley. And we've got Dr. Roy Chun Lee. Yes, right here. While they settle, I just want to mention one event we have coming up, which is on July July 2nd. We haven't yet advertised it, but it's an all-day program that we're doing in cooperation with the Prospect Foundation and the Mainland Affairs Council that will feature Chen Mingtong, the Minister of Mainland Affairs, and a U.S. government high representative as well. That's going to be on July 2nd. We haven't sent out the invitation yet because it's still in the works, but it'll be all day. You can go ahead and mark it on your calendar from now. So with that, let me turn it over to our panel. As I said, we're going to do this a little bit differently than we have done in the past. We're going to have one panel here on the economic side of the U.S.-Taiwan relationship, and then we're going to go to another panel that'll talk more on the political security side of things. So first, on the econ side, I'd like to start with Riley, if we could. We're sort of seated in a different configuration here, but I'd like to start with Riley. Riley is the Heritage Foundation's policy analyst for Asian economy and technology. He specializes in Asia macroeconomic issues, as well as trade, foreign investment, emerging technology, cybersecurity, a number of other related issues. He's written very specifically on Taiwan, most notably a long piece he did last November entitled "A Neglected Partner in Asia, the U.S. Should Strengthen Economic Cooperation with Taiwan." If you haven't read that yet, I suggest you go to our website and download it and take a look at it. He has some very practical ideas for how we can strengthen the economic relationship with Taiwan above and beyond that free trade agreement, which Heritage has been supporting for literally decades. I should point out, too, that Riley has a bachelor's and master's degree in economics from George Mason University. I don't always mention everyone's academic background, but in a city where economics is much more abused than respected, I always think it's good to point out when somebody has an economics degree in particular. So Riley's going to start us off, and then we'll turn to Dr. Roy Chun Lee, who is Associate Research Fellow and Deputy Director of the Taiwan WTO and RTA Center at Tsinghua Institution for Economic Research, a group that we've worked with a lot in the past, actually. Dr. Lee is a policy advisor for Taiwan's trade negotiations with China, New Zealand, and Singapore, and a capital-based expert for Taiwan's delegation for WTO services trade meetings and on liberalization in Taiwan more generally. He's also a columnist himself, so you can see some of his work also in the public domain. Dr. Lee received his PhD from Crawford School of Public Policy at Australian National University. So welcome, mate. We'll start with Riley and get us
down under.
Yeah.
All right. Good morning. As Walter was saying, we published this report back in November. You can find it on heritage.org. I encourage you to read it, mostly because I'm more or less giving an update to what I talked about in this paper today, talking about the importance of the U.S.-Taiwan economic relationship, an area where I think there's not enough attention being paid to. Certainly we talk about the diplomatic relationships, either bilaterally or multilaterally. We talk about the security cooperation and areas of sort of strengthening that, but we don't really hear a whole lot about the economics of things. We don't really see much movement, I think, either from Congress or the administration on economic cooperation with Taiwan. Something I hope we can expand upon, certainly as we, whether we are trying to build allies in the Asia Pacific or if we're just looking at ways to confront China and sort of turn away from the influence that they have in the region. So I'll briefly talk about some of the highlights: imports, exports, investment, all good things. Right now, the U.S.-Taiwan economic relationship is actually at a really good point. That is to be taken in context, of course, with just overall macroeconomic indicators. Taiwan's total exports, imports have actually been decreasing recently, but the U.S. is a special case, one of just a few countries, including Netherlands, Vietnam, and Australia, that are actually seeing an increase in imports and exports. So total trade is increasing. Total trade so far this year is up 14% between the United States and Taiwan. Last month alone, we traded $6.9 billion worth of goods, which is significant. We've seen a moderate increase in exports to Taiwan. I think most strikingly, and we can probably talk about sort of the domestic energy environment within Taiwan, but I think the most interesting export is their increase in export of crude oil and petroleum products to Taiwan, which have doubled since last year and are roughly about 6 million barrels a month at this point. Last year, or 2 years ago, we almost had none, just maybe a few 100,000 here or there. There's increasing imports from Taiwan. So the majority of goods that the United States and Taiwan trade, it's a mutual gain of capital goods, industrial supplies, both back and forth. So it's indicative that the United States and Taiwan maintain strong supply chains that are both mutually beneficial for our economies. But of course, what is trade without investment? Building the supply chains themselves. And this too is actually trending upward, leading to the growth and creation of thousands of direct and indirect jobs, both in the United States and in Taiwan. Last year, 2018, was a particularly interesting year, and so much so that I would actually consider it an outlier. According to data from the Ministry of Economic Affairs, Taiwan entities invested $2 billion in the U.S. last year. This is a 2.5-time increase from 2017. And if you take that with the fact that to date, Taiwan entities have invested roughly $17.5 billion in the United States, it's a significant number. I think this year we're probably going to have a bit of a smaller number, but more to trend. So positive growth of investment in the United States, just like there's positive growth of U.S. investment in Taiwan. Actually, U.S. investment in Taiwan is $23.4 billion to date. Just, I suppose, as a comparison, we can't necessarily talk about trade and investment without, of course, talking a little bit about China. So, in comparison, Taiwan investment in China has actually been trending downward since 2015, and this year is no different. Taiwan investment in China is down almost 45% this year compared to last. So I mean, there's positive trends in the bilateral relationship, the economic relationship that we have, and positive trends in those outstanding concerns, right? So the concerns that perhaps the U.S. and or Taiwan are increasingly becoming reliant on China's economy in a time of instability in both the U.S.-China relationship and regional concerns for China's economic growth. I would be remiss, of course, to not talk about just the relationship between U.S. and Taiwan as partners in economic freedom. We often, of course, talk about Taiwan as one of the poster child, one of the highlights of economic freedom in the region. And of course, this year, they have ranked 10th in our Index of Economic Freedom. This gives them a rank of 5th in the region, in the Asia-Pacific region. They have a score of 77.3 out of 100, so still room for improvement. Almost everything did improve this year except for government integrity and tax burden. So there was some shifts in taxing in 2018 that kind of had a negative effect on this score. Meanwhile, though, it's doing better than the United States. The United States is ranked 12th overall in the world with a score of 76.8. So in relative score, there's not much difference, but in overall score, there's not much difference. But in relative, it's a rank of 2. So for the United States, we have, of course, concerns about our fiscal health, labor freedom, monetary freedom, and trade freedom. I think this one is probably the most outstanding and a concern for us. We would like to see that the United States have more free trade agreements. Certainly Heritage, we've been advocating for a free trade agreement with Taiwan for over 40 years now. I believe the minister without a portfolio, John Dung, who is in town, I believe, today, has also recently expressed his optimism for a US-Taiwan Free Trade Agreement. And The American Chamber of Commerce in Taiwan is also frequently advocating for the movement, progress on a bilateral trade agreement between the United States and Taiwan. So it's something that we should continue to push for. I'll go into a little bit about why I think that's less of a possibility. But for now, I think it's important to highlight that one of the reasons that we should have a bilateral trade agreement with Taiwan is the concern that Taiwan is being left out of these regional trade agreements. CPTPP, or the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, went into force in December. So they can begin accepting new members. However, I've seen no indication that any of the members have extended a welcome to Taiwan as of yet. I mean, I think they're still trying to consider other countries. I think Taiwan would be an excellent partner, and hopefully, there can be some progress there. Certainly, Taiwan is a member of the WTO and an important member of the regional supply chain. So it's indicative that they be considered for its ascension. The idea of the Indo-Pacific strategy, expanding free and fair and reciprocal trade. Well, it's hard for the United States. It's easy to say that. For some countries, it's harder, like Taiwan. It's harder for economies like Taiwan to pursue those things when they are actively being kept out of both bilateral and regional trade agreements. So it's something that I think we should hope to strive more for, get our regional allies, get the U.S. to promote more of Taiwan in these regional partnerships. One way, of course, is through our own bilateral trade agreement with Taiwan. I think it could be done relatively quickly. If we began the process for a free trade agreement with Taiwan today, I think we could get it done relatively quick. Relatively quicker than a U.S.-Japan FTA could get done, actually. Right now with Japan, we have a lot of, or at least in the U.S.-Japan relationship, there's a lot of lingering concerns over the tariffs on auto imports. So I think this itself could have a delaying effect to getting a U.S.-Japan FTA done, certainly before we move into the presidential election cycle. But that is also a concern that I have for a U.S.-Taiwan FTA, and of course there is Taiwan's own domestic politics to consider into this as well, and whether any potential future candidate or would be as supportive of a U.S.-Taiwan free trade agreement. Also, I was saying this earlier, the administration and Congress are a mixed bag when it comes to Taiwan. Again, security-wise, we're very supportive. Economically, there's not much going on, I guess, at least in the government-to-government side. Again, at least people-to-people, it's good. But government, we haven't had a trade and investment framework agreement talk since 2016, not in the entirety of President Trump's administration so far have we had a TIFA talk. And so one thing that we would, the same reason that we don't have an FTA is the same reason that we are not having TIFA talks. It's because we get bogged down by certain issues, more explicitly the pork and other ag issues that we have with Taiwan. So one thing that we've advocated for, and it's laid out in this paper, again, I encourage you all to read, is the promotion of a high-level economic dialogue with Taiwan. This is similar to what we had with Japan 2 years ago before we entered free trade negotiations, and it would certainly be in line with the Taiwan Travel Act to encourage higher-level relations between the governments of Taiwan and the United States. Hopefully to encourage a process toward an FTA. But nonetheless, hopefully we can get something done there. One of the things that we're supposed to talk about, I believe, today are the opportunities for U.S. and Taiwan relationship. I think one area of cooperation or one area of potential progress, which is still being flushed out for everyone else's context, is on electronic commerce or e-commerce. Right now, Japan is leading this, or Prime Minister Abe plans to take a lead on this at the G20 summit at the end of this month. There's already talks about it at the lower ministerial levels. There is consideration for it at the WTO. I think Taiwan has an opportunity here, and the United States and Taiwan have an opportunity to cooperate in this area. The digital economy, which e-commerce makes up a factor of, makes up 6.9% of U.S. GDP, and which, of course, the tech provided through Taiwan supplies has allowed for this type of growth. So I think it's something to consider. Going forward, there are some concerns on both sides. Certainly, I think on the U.S. side, trade is the most outstanding concern. We are, of course, not just tariffing the countries that we have concerns with, but we're applying tariffs to our friends and allies, Taiwan included, much included in this, which we hope we can shift away from and consider more important and other areas for cooperation. For Taiwan, I think just looking at the macroeconomic indicators that are out there, household savings have been increasing, but peaked in 2016. And by my indications, the population is going to peak within the next 10 years, right? So this is a concern. Demographics are a concern. Employment is also a concern. There's less total hours being worked, less total hours working, meaning less GDP growth per hours worked. And of course, there are some new and emerging concerns, at least in the bilateral relationship. One, for example, is the proliferation of the sharing economy in Asia, not just Taiwan, other countries, but in Taiwan's case, I will mention that recent regulations regarding Uber and regulating them as a ride-sharing company have become concerning. Hopefully, though, of course, the administration and Congress can sort of help push greater economic cooperation, greater economic ties with Taiwan. It certainly helps if the U.S. can figure out its economic relationships with other countries in the region as well. Potentially, if we have an agreement with China by the end of this year, then perhaps regional instability around trade and investment can be reduced as well. I want to get to, of course, mention China for just a second, because it is such a lingering factor in so many things that we talk about these days. I think mostly too within the context of the US-Taiwan relationship. The fact that the Trump administration continues to apply tariffs, I think, is indicative of a lacking in strategy against China. They do have a number of concerns, and a lot of them are right. I don't think anyone disputes the concerns that the administration has, or the fact that being tough on China is bad. I think there's no disagreement there. But the approach through tariffs is, I think, the least effective measure to get at these concerns. And so if you want to look at it, you can go on the Heritage website. We have over a dozen variety of recommendations for how we think the Trump administration can deal with issues, just economic issues that China presents. We don't believe that this short-term pain will necessarily guarantee long-term gain. But at the end, we think the president will probably make a deal, and so hopefully things will resolve at that end. But there are other outstanding issues like Huawei, 5G technology. I think these are going to continue to be concerns and issues going forward, even if we have a trade deal. So with that, I'm going to leave it there and trade it over.
Great, thank you, Riley. I'm glad that you raised the Uber issue, and I just wanted to put a more general cast on it. I mean, it's one company that people are focused on. It's not like the interests of this one company are so important. It's the principle of the thing. It's the ability of an economy, especially one that's ranked 10th freest in the world, to be able to accommodate innovation. And innovation is certainly disruptive. It is all of the time. But anywhere I have been, consumers are enthusiastic about Uber.
Yeah.
You know, because in a lot of cities, they're hostage to surly cab drivers who don't want to stop and pick them up necessarily,
Right.
or whose credit card machines always seem to be broken. So Uber is responding to that. It's the market responding to a need.
Right.
And it's not that we care so much about Uber as a company, it's that we support an economy being able to accommodate a response like that. And then,
I'll just say, yeah, Uber is not just the sole target of this. It applies to all ride-sharing services, and it's not just indicative of anti-innovation policies, but it's anti-competition.
yeah, right, yeah. And then the FTA, I swear, I don't understand what's so hard about this. I mean, I could understand, okay, the Bush administration, they had some priorities in the Middle East they needed to focus on. They were in sort of a mode of putting off some of the harder decisions on Taiwan or on China. And then Obama was generally, I think, you know, in a careful mode with China, tiptoeing around it. So I can understand this. But this administration, I mean, they routinely offend a lot of people. You know, they routinely offend the Chinese. Why not offend them on something that was actually substantive? If you're going to offend somebody, make something of it, right? So I don't understand why we can't get there, but I can tell you Heritage will continue to plug away at it. It's only been 30 years, 40 years, but we'll keep working on it till it actually happens. Let me turn it over to you, Dr. Lee.
Thank you. I need to get the remote.
Go.
Thank you for having me today, and please bear with me. I'm going to present my thoughts using this very Taiwanese style. We use PowerPoints all the time. Without that, I don't really know how to carry on my speech, so please bear with me. And thank you for having Rally to start with this panel, because that will skip, for me to skip a lot of backgrounds about the basic economic relationship between US and Taiwan, and that's exactly my focus will be today. I'll be looking at some of the key features for the last 40 years, taking advantage of this occasion to commemorate the 40-year anniversary of the Taiwan Relations Act. And I would like to offer some prospect and the possible framework of future collaboration and partnership between Taiwan and US economically. Now, let me start with the first. I'll divide the last 40 years into four 10-year time period. In the first 10 year, between 1979 to 1989, I think the key feature is the US was something like China to Taiwan today. Number one trading partner, number one source of FDI. For example, in 1985, almost half, 50% of Taiwan's export goes to the US. That is very similar to what we are doing with China. So US was China back in the late 70s and early 80s. And that creates a lot of trade tension. Taiwan is running increasingly large trade surplus with the US. So the US starts, because of the trade deficit, we start negotiation for further market opening and measures to reduce the trade deficit with the US. Taiwan used to be the second largest source of trade deficit, just next to Japan, back in the 85 to 87 time period. So looking back in history, you find very interesting similarities of what happened 40 years ago and what happened now, right? Just that the players are different, but trade structures and the issues, the contingent issues remain very similar. Move to the next phase, 1989 to 1999. I think the most unique characteristic feature of this 10 years is the rise of Taiwan as a kingmaker. That is, Taiwan stopped exporting consumer products and start to focus more on intermediate inputs to facilitate and support the development of high-tech sectors, especially for the United States. Look at the table here. You see all the names remain until today the largest contract manufacturer for laptops, pads, and PCs, and all these US brands. For example, Quanta Computer was established in 1988, and it is until today the largest laptop contract manufacturer, and its clients includes HP, Dell, Apple, and you name it. Right? So most of these companies, including TSMI, which is the largest independent foundry, semiconductor foundry, were all created around this time period. So it is a very interesting period of time when Taiwan starts to focus more on this contract manufacturing rather than producing or pursuing a brand name strategy. And also, what took off during this time period is the investment from Taiwan to China. If you look at the chart on my right, in 1991, Taiwan's FDI to China accounts only for around 9.5% of total outbound FDI from Taiwan. That number increased to 40.7% in 2 years' time in 1993. At the highest peak back in 2010, I think, 81% of Taiwan's FDI goes to China. So China becomes the backyard of manufacturing capacity for Taiwan, and it all started sometime in 1990, 1991.
And 80% that's in flow for 1 year.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. So for the year 2010, for example, 81% of Taiwan's outbound FDI goes to one single market, that is China. But that reduced to 40-something in 2018. And while Taiwan remains the kingmaker today, you can look at the structure of Taiwan's export to the US. Majority of them are intermediate inputs, capital products, parts and components, semi-finished products, accounts for almost 83% of Taiwan's total export to the United States. And that's above average. On the right-hand side, that's the average, the structure of the US imports globally. You can see US imported 30% of our Euro consumer products from foreign export, whereas for Taiwan, that accounts only for 70%. So we are not really selling consumer products. We are supplying intermediate inputs. So that's why I denote Taiwan's role as a kingmaker or a critical center player of the supply chain surrounding US companies. And in the next 10 years, Taiwan became formally a WTO member, which, with the help of the United States, kicked off the application to become a WTO member in the 1990s, early 1991, and after 10-year negotiation, we formally joined the WTO on January 2002. And it's another unique development during this 10-year period, again, is the intensity of trade and investment between Taiwan and China starts to accelerate, right? I borrowed this chart from your paper, really, just to promote the importance of this paper. You can see Taiwan's trade between vis-a-vis Taiwan's trade with the United States. You can see China's trade. China becomes very rapidly, in a very brief period of time, the largest export market for Taiwan. But the most interesting part is on my right-hand side, it is a figure summarized by the Congressional Research Service here in DC, indicating that Taiwan's order from the US increased between 2002 until 2017. But the actual direct export from Taiwan actually remained very flat, which is an indication that Taiwan manufactured most of the orders somewhere else outside Taiwan. So we're not really exporting those orders locally in Taiwan. We're receiving the orders in Taiwan, but we manufacture somewhere else, most likely in China. So it becomes the beginning and the creation of this US-Taiwan China triangular supply network. Well, Taiwan's trade with China is one of the indications of this supply network between US, Taiwan, China. You can say almost 91% of Taiwan's export to China are intermediate inputs, capital goods, intermediate inputs. Consumer products accounts for less than 10%, about 9% of Taiwan export. We're not really selling, again, we are actually seeing this is a reflection of China as being the world factory, especially the factory supporting Taiwan's partnership with the United States. In the last 10 years, we see the deepening of the triangular supply network. The blue bar in this chart, sorry, I forgot to, because there are two laptop computers. The blue bar in this chart reflects the percentage of products, the ratio of manufacturing location of export orders. Assuming we receive $100 order from the United States. Back in 2010, about $48 of these orders are manufactured in Taiwan, and about 43% of the products are manufactured in China. But in 2004, sorry, should be, there's a typo, it should be 2014, 2015. You start to see a shift of the manufacturing location away from Taiwan and move to China. In 2014, China produced more export orders than we did in Taiwan, which means most of the export orders we receive from the US companies are manufactured now in China. It remained the same until 2017, even though the ratio of China-made export orders are coming down and indicating that some of the manufacturing activities are actually returning back to Taiwan. But China remains one of the most important locations for Taiwan's manufacturers.
So by this you mean the final assembly? When you talk about where it's coming from, export is the final assembly point.
Many of them are final assembly, but increasingly, maybe in the middle,
Intermediate good to the United States could come from China.
China as well, yes, by a Taiwanese company for delivering the U.S. order.
Right.
That's what we define as the triangular supply network. But out of all these sectors, the most important sector is actually the information and technology products. 70% of Taiwan's ICT products are manufactured outside Taiwan, and 90% of them are manufactured in China. Right. So many of these ICT companies are now caught in the crossfire of the trade and technology war between U.S. and China because of this structure. The next will be, for example, electric machineries. Half of our electro machinery products are manufactured outside Taiwan, and about 70% of this overseas manufacturing took place in China. But interestingly, if you can see the second largest category of products we manufacture outside Taiwan is electronics. About 60% of Taiwan's electronics are manufactured outside Taiwan, but the ratio of those products manufactured in China is about 30%. So that means we have actually manufacturing capacity in Vietnam, Malaysia, Thailand, rather than in China. China accounts only for 30% of the electronics. So if we talk about the concentration, the dependency rate issue, we are basically talking about the ICT sector dependency problem that we are facing with China. So please, let's meet some of the victims of the trade war. Back in 2016, top 10 Chinese exporters to the US, 8 of them are Taiwanese companies. And most of these companies on this chart, and this Chinese character chart, are contract manufacturers of ICT products, laptops, pads, smartphones, for example. According to one of these Chinese database, 45% of China's export of computer and office equipment are manufactured by Taiwanese, Hong Kong, and Macau companies. Given the size of the Macau and Hong Kong manufacturing sector, I think most of these are most likely produced by Taiwanese companies in investing and operating in China. So if the trade war will be extended from the current 250 billion to the remaining 300 billion Chinese imports, you see that the primary targets will be notebook PCs and smartphones, which accounts for almost half of the remaining 300 billion Chinese imports coming to the United States. And if those products are subject to the 25% additional tariff, many of the Taiwanese companies from the previous chart will be facing a very difficult time in addressing these new dynamics of this. I mean, the breaking down of this triangular supply network. Taiwan understands, many of the Taiwanese companies, especially the Taiwan government, understand the risks, but there are distorted market signals which delays the decision for many of the Taiwanese companies to pursue at least a China plus one strategy. That is to diversify their production concentration issue. One of the sources of distortion is the China's approach of the so-called two hands approach. On one hand, China tightened up political pressure on Taiwan, but on the other hand, China provides more increasingly large number of preferential treatments to attract and to keep Taiwanese investments in China, even though based on market decisions, they should be planning to depart or at least to dilute or reduce their reliance on China. And also the One Belt, One Road initiative, the so-called China Drain initiative, are all keeping many of the Taiwanese investments stop making decisions or to take hedge actions against these risks that they are facing. So strategically, despite the fact that there are huge costs out of this US-China trade and tech rivalries, the trade and technology conflicts between the US and China might compensate this distortion and push Taiwanese investors in China to start making sensible and realistic decisions. And you can see our trade with China decreased for the first quarter of this year vis-a-vis the first quarter of last year when the trade war hasn't really started yet. But our export to the US actually increased 20%, comparing the first quarter of this year vis-a-vis the first quarter of last year, right? So we are returning to the 1980s trade relationship between Taiwan and the US. So finally, let me wrap up with what happened in the next 10 years. We'll look at what happened in the past 40 years and what happened in the next 10 years. That is a question that's being raised and asked many, many times in Taiwan. Is there going to be a delamination of supply network between the US and China? I think decoupling will be too gentle to describe this very messy process. Delamination might be the more appropriate way to describe this process, right? A costly and very complicated, confusing situation that all these companies are facing. So are we seeing a Team US supply network and separate from Team China supply network? What are the roles? What Taiwan is going to play as a supplier in this Team US supply system? And what's Taiwan's decision if some of the Taiwanese manufacturers remain in Team China? That's the questions that I think we have to start really seriously thinking. there are some experiences that we can borrow. For example, Japan faced similar shock back in 2012 when this Shinjuku, sorry, I don't really know how, Shinjuku Island incident. For 2 months, we see huge protests, boycotts, against Japanese brands and Japanese products and Japanese investments in China. So the investment from Japan to China dropped about 40% in the following year, in 2013. It dropped another 40% on the following year. So 65% drop after reaching the peak in 2012 because of these risks and this awareness of this danger that Japanese investments are facing in China.
You still couldn't describe this as decoupling, though.
Yes, so we just
Still a-
replaced the
still
shock.
No, but I'm saying it's still a very significant trading relationship between
Yes,
China
yes,
and Japan,
yes.
and a very significant supply chain relationship.
Definitely, but we see an act of rebalancing because of this, let's say, shock or this risk that they are facing. I think Taiwan investments in China are facing similar situation, right? So we see I borrowed this chart from Jetro, and it's a very Japanese style, a lot of information, so please try to
This
digest.
slide makes the whole slideshow worth it.
Yes, of course, that's right. What this chart is saying is that most of these Japanese investments throughout China and the Asia-Pacific region are not really using those companies as production base. They are actually investment in Malaysia and Taiwan to meet the local demand. They are not really exporting products that are manufactured in Malaysia to the US. You can see in the first, I can't really point out, but for Taiwan, 64% of Japanese companies' products manufactured in Taiwan are for the local supply. They are not exporting to other markets. They are to meet the demand from the Taiwanese side. Similar structure for Vietnam, for China, even for Thailand. So they don't see those companies as war factory. They see those companies as clients, right? And even more interestingly is that for Japanese company manufactured in Taiwan, Malaysia, Taiwan, Vietnam, and China, the number one export market, if they are exporting, the other way around. If they are exporting back to Japan. You can see for Vietnam, 62.4% of Japanese products made in Vietnam are exported back to Japan. For China, it's also about 62%. So Japan is the hub for the exportation of Japanese product to US and European Union. All these companies in Asia Pacific are the supply network of intermediate inputs. The final assembly activities most likely took place somewhere in Japan. Direct export of Japanese companies in China to the United States only accounts for about 5.9%. So they are not, it's very different structure from what Taiwan is doing. Most of Taiwanese companies are manufacturing on behalf of the US companies in China, and they export directly from China to the United States. 90% of Taiwanese iPhones manufactured in China are exported directly from China to the United States. Whereas for Japan, only 9.5% of Japanese products manufactured in China are exported directly to the United States. 62% of them are exported back to Japan. So what I'm saying here is that there are experiences that we can learn from each other. The trade war is a shock, but this shock happened somewhere else. And in historical perspective, we learn from the previous lessons. So finally, perhaps there will be a new supply network between Taiwan and the US. So we are looking at Taiwanese company manufactured in Taiwan for the United States, but equally likely we're going to see some Taiwanese investment, increasing number of Taiwanese investments coming to the US manufacturing on behalf of the US companies. And many of these manufacturing activities are based on trust, right? Especially for the emerging technology sectors, trust, data protection, security are trust-based economics, trust-based manufacturing activities. So we require a lot of increasing level of innovation and research and development collaborations. It requires attention being paid to capturing the digital opportunities. For example, Japan is pursuing this data-free flow with trust, or the FFT initiatives. That should be expanded also to Taiwan-US partnership. FTA is essential if we are going to encourage more Taiwan-based manufacturer in Taiwan and also Taiwan-based manufacturer in the United States. FTA is the missing link or the foundation for a lot of legal certainties. And education is important. If Team US needs Taiwan as the key member of manufacturing, education on science, technology, mathematics, and engineering are very important. I think there should be an elevated level of collaboration between the US and Taiwan on STEAM education. And finally, Indo-Pacific New Southern policy. I think there are a lot of things that can be done on software infrastructures, healthcare, medical cooperation, education, vocational capital. That's all what Taiwan is doing with ASEAN partners, and I think that's also consistent with what the Indo-Pacific strategy is pursuing. So that's another area of economic cooperation that we should be thinking about for the next 10 years to come. I think I took too long time, so thank you.
That was outstanding. Thank you very much for
Thank
that.
you.
I wanted to come back to this issue of how the supply chains are structured. 'Cause you're looking at it from the perspective of dealing with reality, and that's what the companies are dealing with too. It's a shock. They've got to be able to structure their supply chains in the most efficient way, given the facts that the environment is presenting them.
Yes.
But there's also people who are advocating for decoupling or advocating for what they call bending the supply chains. And there's so many problems with that, with those ideas generally. But one in particular I wanted to ask you about is that it's not so easy to change suppliers or change your manufacturing locations or your sourcing locations. And people talk about this like it's done like that. Oh, we'll just move to Vietnam. Everyone will move to Vietnam. Everybody will move to Malaysia. It's all changing. You got to have people in Vietnam and Malaysia.
Yeah.
And they're already doing a lot of other work, right? And so there's a capacity issue there's a capacity issue in the United States. You talked about STEM education. I run into foreign companies in the United States a lot of times who have a difficulty with the US job market that way, where they have to train people and all the rest. So could you comment on that? What is the capacity out there to restructure supply chains in Vietnam or anywhere else? How do you address that issue?
Some of the OECD reports indicate that the most challenging task foreign investment facing in Asia, in especially ASEAN countries, is the shortage of supply of qualified workers. Right. So it's not corruption. It's not about infrastructure. It's not about lack of sufficient financial capacity. It's the lack of qualified workers. Right. So I think capacity building, vocational capacity building, not pursuing degree type of education, are critically important. This is one of the reasons why Taiwan's New Southern policy we have 5 flagship programs. And one of the flagship programs are actually indeed providing vocational training capacity to our New Southern policy partner country, especially ASEAN countries. So we're talking about 6 months, 8 months on-the-job training, tailor-made to meet the specific requirements of a specific manufacturing sectors. Right? So I think vocational training is key. Also, let's not forget Taiwan. I mean, Taiwanese company not necessarily have to go to Southeast Asia. They can always come back to Taiwan. Many of the companies keep some capacity, manufacturing capacity back home in Taiwan. They have unused production lines. They have lands reserved for manufacturing, but they have been put on idle for the last 10 years, but now they are bringing back all these events. Quanta Computer, for example, just announced 2 weeks ago that they are bringing back the production line for Dell laptops back to a city outside Taipei. Right, so from next year on, many of the Dell's laptops will be manufactured in Taiwan. So it takes a lot of time. Sometimes will be impossible for some of these sectors to move out of China. But Foxconn, for example, just announced 2 days ago that they are ready to manufacture all the iPhones outside China if they are forced to do so. I don't know how they are going to do that. They have iPhone factories in India and Brazil, maybe in Taiwan, but they say they are confident that if they are forced to, they will be able to deliver all the iPhones outside China. Right? But the key is, let me put it this way: the key is we should be thinking about what will be the reaction from Beijing. Beijing doesn't want Foxconn to leave. It will undermine the stability of this whole system, right? If Foxconn is the largest private manufacturer in China, and if Foxconn is leaving, then the whole system will see, we are going to see a kind of vicious circle that is creating, right? So Foxconn, my own view, Foxconn doesn't have the freedom to leave. It's not up to Foxconn to leave, right? They have to consult Beijing. They have to ask permission, and Beijing is not going to approve that. So that's the final challenge that I think sometimes we forget to look into, China's willingness to maintain stability.
And it could be a negotiating position on Foxconn's part. Right? It could be a start of a discussion to show the Chinese that they have options, even if they may not have as many as they suggest. Exactly. It's a good place to start if you're on their side of the ledger there. Are there other questions? Yeah, Dennis.
Professor, you mentioned Foxconn. I have a lot of relatives, brother, cousins in Wisconsin. Foxconn has become a huge issue. It feeds into your analysis, too, of Taiwan manufacturing moving from China to go to the U.S. to Taiwan in the U.S. But it's become kind of a PR disaster. It's become a political disaster in Wisconsin because you have the pictures of the empty field. I think it was last year, Paul Ryan, who was then Speaker, Scott Walker, who was then Governor, President Trump helped dig the field. Wisconsin gave unprecedented tax breaks to Foxconn. Foxconn then said, we're opening a supply warehouse in Green Bay. Oh, and it's Wisconsin companies. It turned out to be a company with headquarters in Europe and New England. So I've said to a Taiwan friend, I said, well, Terry Go, even with the sea goddess, he might not affect the Taiwan election, but he could affect the American election next year because President Trump's popularity has fallen through the basement in Wisconsin over this issue. It's a huge issue because the people of Wisconsin, and the other problem you mentioned, Foxconn had this huge factory in China, 130,000. They had a suicide, labor unrest, so they're trying to get out. But they also cut that from 130,000 to 70,000 in China because of automation and robotization. So the people of Wisconsin were promised 15,000 jobs, but now Foxconn's saying, oh, we're going to automation, robotization. So the question I have, I mean, in your grand scheme of things, how does that fit in? Foxconn's the biggest employer in China, right? And they want to come to Wisconsin, but the 15,000 jobs might not be there. The promises might not be there. So in this transferring foreign direct investment from China to the United States, how do you deal with these issues like creating jobs and keeping a good PR message for Taiwan?
Do I have to answer on behalf of Foxconn? Well, you see, we always joke, why, Foxconn in Taiwan's name is actually Honghai Precision Electric, it's not Foxconn. So why it is called Foxconn? Because of Terry's Fox style of negotiating things, right? This is not the first happening. Indonesia complained a lot previously about this company seeking preferential offers and tax reliefs, and they didn't keep their promise about investment and job creations. But I have to say, Foxconn has its own calculation. He has his own way of doing things. It might be wrong, might be right. I can't really answer for that company, but what I'm talking about is this general trend, this macro development. There might be companies as bad as Foxconn, but there will be even more companies who are really creating and bringing jobs, not only to the US, also back to Taiwan. Right? So yes, there are problems with Foxconn, but I don't think we should, all of these issues that Foxconn create, this shouldn't undermine. This general trend, I don't think we can stop if the market pushes everybody to that direction. I don't think we can stop that, right? But we can correct, compensate, and adjust to that cost and bad things that happen along the way. But I think the trend is a question mark. I don't know. Everybody's guessing. Right? Maybe there's no Team USA. There's only one team. I don't know. Maybe there's no decoupling theory. But if that is happening, I think the best way is to address the issues, but not to stop the direction of dynamics.
As I was saying earlier, the trend of Taiwanese investment is increasing. So whether Foxconn Terrigo actually comes through with his promises or not, the trend outside of Foxconn is increasing anyway. So at least there is some positive effects from Taiwanese investment in the United States. Terry is now a politician. I think that's pretty stark and obvious. So I think, of course, he, as an individual, would probably say things to garnish favor for not just a business, but a foreign business operating in the United States, led by a former businessman. So I think might be some politics involved in that as well, which of course tend to have backlash when those promises don't actually fall through. But getting to your point, just I do want to make a quick point about automation. This is going to be a trend we're going to see everywhere. It's not just going to be China. China's going to have a big problem with that actually too. But it's going to be in the United States and elsewhere as well. Not to say that it's going to be bad. There's going to be disruption, and it's going to be hard for some folks, but I'm pretty positive that at the end of the day, it'll have at least a net positive outcome.
We were talking about possibilities in the U.S.-Taiwan relationship formally, like what kind of negotiations we can do, FTA and that sort of thing. And I am by far not the best Donald Trump reader, the person who can understand him the best and get inside his head. But I will dare say this promise from Terry Guo will be a big problem in the relationship moving forward. The fact that it hasn't taken place, it will be a part of the calculus, I think, going forward. And then were he to become president, man, I don't know. There's a whole lot of things to worry about in that case. But
maybe the money will come in once Terry was nominated by the KMT,
yeah, okay. Okay.
Just to increase his possibility of winning the election. So who knows?
Yeah, I guess the thing is, how can you make a promise like that? It's just that was the mistake in the first place. Maybe
Yes.
being so bold to be able to predict where your business was going to be in another couple of years. Yeah, right.
Richard Coleman, I'm retired from Customs and Border Protection. The guy who was one of the guys who was working on TPP was right next to my cubicle. They worked long and hard on a document that was going to keep the United States in play in Asian politics and trade, and we got nothing when we went out. But my question is, next year, this is a political question. Does the Kuomintang offer the Taiwanese electorate vote for us? We're going to retain our traditional Chinese ties, economic and political. Is that the distinction that they're going to carry with them, or how do they relate to the notion of Taiwanese independence from China?
You want to
Sounds
go?
like a long question, a long answer. I have no idea, honestly. I mean, we'll just have to sort of, I think we're still in wait and see. It's sort of like US politics. We're still kind of in waiting for the foreign policy side to get out to, of course, Taiwan cross-strait relations isn't necessarily foreign policy as much as it is domestic policy in Taiwan, but I don't know. You have a better answer?
I think we manage whatever happens in the election from the U.S. side. We've dealt with both parties from the U.S., and we could deal with an independent for that matter. I don't think it's in U.S. interest, or it's really a part of its business to decide how that, who Taiwan elects. And what kind of relationship a new government in Taiwan will have with China, I think is also complicated. It's not just a matter of getting elected and then, okay, I'm king, I can do whatever I want now, especially in Taiwan. I think there'll continue to be breaks on the system, and there'll continue to be influence from the other side. Even if you have a government elected that's a relatively pro-China government, you're still going to have pushback. You're just have back and forth. You're still going to have a democratic process that couches exactly how far the government can go.
I want to listen to the U.S. perspective first. Then I have my own observations. I think one of the hopefuls, for example, Mayor Han Kuo-yu, I think at the starting phase of this campaign process, I don't think he understands fully about the implication of the trade war. So he is still talking about some policies that based on rational considerations 8-10 years ago. So when he first raised the issue of this so-called free liberalization demonstration zone, he still talk about opening up Chinese agricultural products that are currently prohibited to come to Taiwan, to demonstrate to be confined in this area, and we can manufacture and become foodstuff and re-export, right? So, but repeatedly he was warned that this is not a war now. That's 8 years ago, maybe it's working. 8 years later, it is not. You are sending the wrong signal. You're telling people the wrong message, right? So in his final version of this free liberalization demonstration zone, he took out of these Chinese agricultural product ideas, right? So I think he starts to understand that the world is very different now. 8 years ago, everybody goes to China. 8 years later, at least people start to reconsider the relationship now. So I think they need to learn. While Terry Gao talk about trade war, but everybody, I shouldn't be making comments on most of these people. I think they become cautious about this Chinese way. So they have a lot of complaints about the current administration, but increasingly they become cautious about how Taiwan is going to interact with China economically, because the war is really very much different now.
Yeah, having been around Washington a while, both cases sound like to me one of these what the boss meant to say sort of situations.
Yes.
Sometimes the boss isn't entirely up on the facts and the dynamics that he needs to be in order to make bold statements, bold predictions, bold promises. So with that, thank you very much to both of you for a terrific discussion on the economic side of things. Thank you. Can you email me the slides? Sure, of course. I'd really like to.
Me too.
I sent you an email this morning, but it was bounced back.
Okay, I'd like to call up the next two panelists to talk about the political security
About
side of the relationship.
it was bounced back. I don't know.
Plug. Look under.
Yeah, maybe. Okay, I think so.
Will you add a battery?
Hopefully not. I'll be okay.
Give me some water.
Do you have a bottle of water? Okay, well, thank you. Another unusual thing is about the way we structured this is usually econ goes last. It is better to do it this way because everybody usually leaves before econ starts in that case. So we got econ a good audience because they stayed to hear the exciting stuff about guns shooting and deep diplomacy and everything else. Well, to help us understand the situation, the political security side, and the prospects of US-Taiwan relations, we've got a couple very knowledgeable experts on that side too. Again, one from Taiwan, one from the United States. First from Taiwan, Dr. Yi-Chung Lei. Dr. Lei is president of the Prospect Foundation. Yi-Chung is a longtime friend of Heritage Foundation. Of course, our relationship goes back long before you became so popular after Tsai Ing-wen got elected, and people started calling on you more often. But Dr. Lai was vice president of the Taiwan think tank and executive director on the mission to the U.S. with the Democratic Progressive Party of Taiwan. His doctorate is from Virginia Tech, so all I can say about that is wahoo wah. That's the Virginia thing. It's University of Virginia Tech rivalry.
Yeah,
thing,
yeah. We always have them.
Yes.
We always beat them in football. So
You always beat them in football. That's absolutely true. And then I'm going to turn to Scott Harold. Scott is Associate Director of the RAND Center for Asia-Pacific Policy, and he's a Senior Political Scientist at RAND Corporation, and also an affiliate faculty member at the Party RAND Graduate School. I guess being a part of RAND, you don't have time to do much else except RAND, sounds like. Several RAND associations. Scott's doctorate is in political science from Columbia University, where he wrote a thesis on China's foreign policy decision-making with respect to its joining the WTO. That was interesting. I didn't know that. I want to talk to you some more about that. I've got a piece coming out next week in Taipei Times about WTO, and particularly Taiwan's membership in it. Scott and I have known each other for several years. It's always a pleasure to bump into him on the rubber chicken circuit, and it's great to have him today on a heritage stage. So with that, let me turn it to you. Yi-Chung, you can get us started, and then we'll turn to Scott.
thank you, Walter, and thanks for inviting me here. I'm very honored to be able to speak over here. I think this panel basically focused on security and defense affairs, especially at the outset of the 40 years anniversary of Taiwan Relations Act. If we look at as a retrospect about the what's happening in terms of defense and security field of the Taiwan-US and Taiwan-China relationship, after the 40 years of the establishment of Taiwan Relations Act, what we can discover is that many of the things that TRA established and tried to address, the situation is now become very different. Of course, the first one is that China right now become a huge superpower, and its capability is, in comparison with the 40 years ago, is way much higher than it was before. And also, 40 years ago, if we look at the Taiwan Strait military balances, at least at that time, that military balance still in Taiwan's favor. And of course, a lot of youngsters probably will not remember that mighty China even had a time that the military balance across the Taiwan Strait is inferior to Taiwan. But it was like that 40 years ago. Of course, another thing about it associated with Chinese rise is that the Chinese international outreach is also very prominent. And that also started to have create new issues and problems for Taiwan. And the third thing is that Taiwan's democratization also created internal dynamics that we haven't witnessed in the past about how the civil military and the civil services and the political appointee, their relationship, which also complicated about the internal cohesion as well as the coherence response to Chinese threat at that time. And so I will just address those in some fashions. When we look at the Taiwan's defense capabilities, I think in 1979, when the US-Taiwan no longer recognized ROC government and the official Taiwan, and so is the military defense treaties. And during those times, especially after 1982, there was the period that Taiwan believed that it has to rely on itself about the defense. And when we talk about rely on itself is that Taiwan would not be able to purchase the weapons from the United States for a certain period of time. And if we look at the Taiwan, one of the major military re-establishment programs, such as IDF, and also about our shipbuilding, which was considered to be one of the biggest, if we turn out of China's, one of the biggest periods that was made, all of them during the 80s, of course, through the licensed production. And since then, until today, we started to see another new indigenous development in terms of our defense articles. So by the submarines and other ship, as well as the tactical the tactical and fighter jets that probably also do use for the fighter as well as for the teaching the pilot how to fly it. And if you look at those development, I think what came out in the 80s is that Taiwan come out with a certain talents of build indigenous domestic defense industrial production capabilities. And interestingly enough, in the 90s, when Taiwan was able to purchase the weapons in a bigger and a more confidence way of getting them, at that time, our capabilities and the talents that was established during the 80s started to filter away. One of the biggest examples is that the engineers that was able to work through the IDF, some of them, they started to depart to Korea and help Korea to build up its own fighter jets and competing against Taiwan. And also, although our shipbuilding's engineers, some of them went to Taichuan, that became one of the backbone for building our newer ship at this time. But also, due to the 90s, the lack of the development about indigenous production, some of them they also went somewhere else. So when we talk about the defense industrial, especially our defense article production capabilities, one of the lessons of what we learned during this time is that how we're able to retain those talents at that time when the income in the U.S. articles is becoming more easier, and our military, of course, due to their confidence of the United States, will tend to purchase the U.S.-made weapon rather than Taiwan's own indigenous weapons. And with that environment, how are we able to retain those talents so that we can continue to have a new blood and especially the know-how, the knowledge that can continue all the way down, and that could also filter into to the civilian production basis to boost our technology. So I think this is just when I look at the defense capabilities, one thing I just came to my mind, I think that's important to address is the lesson that we learned during the 80s and 90s especially with the outpouring of all those talents that we brought during the 80s. How can we avoid that kind of the things that happen again, especially when I witnessed that probably we are going to enter another phase of the major defense production for Taiwan this time. Then another thing that stands out after the 40 years anniversaries is about about Chinese rights and capabilities. But right now, I would like to talk about this capability in terms of international isolation against Taiwan. We all know that China would like to throw everything, try to isolate Taiwan internationally. But I think right now, the Chinese international isolation campaign came out with a new patterns. Instead of relying its own money, its own economic resources to buy out individually of those countries, China right now has a strong presence in UN-led international organizations. And many of the international campaign against Taiwan that China can isolate Taiwan very effectively is precisely because of those Chinese nationals. They are there in those international organizations. And through their presence, they are able to prevent any single traces of Taiwan's presence and even the friendly allies' support for Taiwan. And one example definitely is the WHO. We know that from year 2003 and onward, the WHO Secretary General is a Hong Kong person. Since then, some of the measures that Taiwan would like to undertook found out that response is way different from the previous Secretary Generals. And another example is that the ICAO currently, the Secretary General is also a Chinese. And not to mention about the Chinese presence in the UN organization, where some of the Deputy Secretary General or Assistant Secretary General, they are Chinese. And how are they able to control the administrations, create new norms about whether Taiwan or any activity associated with Taiwan should be addressed, right? And that becomes a norm. And of course, just 2 days ago, we have our two representatives got the invitation to the international, I believe that's weather organizations. But then just when they arrived, they found out that their invitation has been canceled suddenly. And it turns out that the Chinese officials in the administrative unit in that organization sort of play a role in this development. So that right now I would like to just propose, and this is an important phenomenon that when we talk about how to address the issue about international isolation against Taiwan by China, Chinese presence in those international organizations and their capability to control the agenda through the administration. I think that's something that we need to be aware of. And how to address them instead of fighting China on one-by-one in bilateral cases, but how are able to really enforce and require the international organization and administration to really follow what we believe that should be the norm of those organizations. I think that's important. Another thing about it is that 40 years ago, Taiwan is not yet democratized. But also we know that KMT at that time was very much anti-Chinese communist. And today, KMT is one of the leading voices in Taiwan to ask for the reconciliation with the Chinese communists, despite the Chinese communist, tactic and its position hasn't really changed. But what I'm going to say is that along with this KMT's change position, it's not about how KMT's change position affect Taiwan, but what actually contributes to the KMT change position. That's the thing that we need to understand. And because that will probably could be the key to get to know the kind of Chinese penetration, how effective it is within Taiwan. The KMTs and the kind of the dynamics that lead the KMT to change the position. If you look at the early 90s and then what's happening after the year 2000, you can find out that in the early 90s, KMT is actually not only the one that it has its position, but it's actually the organization that's part of the progressive part. Li Denghui, as the chairman of KMT, is leading all the major reform, and the constitutional reform, a change to the constitution, did not start from the DPP. It's actually that Li Denghui and his led KMT that initiate all kinds of reform. And whether people agree with those reforms or not, but at least KMT at that time during the 90s was part of the forces that try to accommodate the democracy and even initiate a certain process within democracy and to push for something. But after year 2000, when DP came in, and KMT also kicked out its Li Denghui as chairman, KMT take a dramatic turn. Instead of embracing the whole democratic process, it seems to me that KMT leadership believed that the democratic process at this time cost their election, or at least the Li Denghui, his embrace of the democratic reform, and to a certain somehow that cost their election, and their position about how to accommodate and embrace the Taiwanese identity come to the halt and had a dramatically 180 degrees U-turn, and by going back to the original route and the Chiang Kai-shek, Jiang Jingguo's line about China and how the Taiwan should be part of China. And so that leads to all the future development, further development as we discovered, as we witness now. One of the leading watershed moment definitely is the year 2005, when the KMT lead have a delegation to China, first by its vice chairman, Jiang Bingkun, and when he led the delegation to China, precisely after 2 weeks of the Taiwan's big rally against anti-secession law. And then later on, 1 month later, is Lianzhan. So I think it is the interesting, the research needs to be done about why the decision by KMT leadership choose to go through that way, because that opens a lot about the KMT's later on decisions, as well as how the free China, as well as the relationship with the United States. And that also opens up another very important question. I think that's for Taiwanese people to really hammer out. That is, with the KMT in the past, during the martial law period, dominated our military, our security services, our intelligence services. When the KMT was changing its position, how much of those influence on them is continue all the way through the military and intelligence security services? Those are very important organs for to safeguard Taiwan national security. How would that also study to affect the institutional management regarding the Taiwan-China relations? Would that and how would they start to interpret about the relationship between the US-China and the US-Taiwan? I think that is another area for now when we try to deal with the Chinese, the so-called influence operation penetration that needs to thoroughly and objectively understood. So I'm just going to stop here because I know Daharo has a lot of very good insights regarding how Taiwan needs to be done for its own defense reform. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Yi-Chung.
Thank you, Walter. It's good to see you again, and it's always a pleasure to learn that where we've been bumping into each other is on the rubber chicken circuit. That's a new one for me. I'll take that home. And I'll take it home and give it to my 8-year-old. Today is his birthday, and so that's a sign of how much the US-Taiwan relationship and my friendship and respect for Walter matter to me, that I will take time today to make it. And of course, 8 in Chinese culture and in Taiwan too is a lucky number. So hopefully we'll have the good luck to have not just the chance to celebrate 40 years, but another 40 years And like all of you who are here today, I am here too because I recognize that this relationship, once an alliance, once a formal diplomatic relationship, still a critically important relationship, both to Taiwan, and I think it's important for Taiwan friends to hear, also critically important to the United States. Walter asked me to talk about the defense of Taiwan and Taiwan's security. I think the first point to make in that conversation is always that which they make when you are dealing with addiction, and that is to recognize and acknowledge the problem. The problem is China. The problem is the threat posed by the People's Republic of China to the security, safety, and freedom of the 24 million people living in Taiwan. The second analytic step, though, is where we get to, I think, what's going to be, hopefully, a part of a fun discussion here, and that is to deconstruct that threat into its component parts. And I think that the way I've chosen to approach this today, Walter, is to talk about those non-kinetic aspects or non-military, non-violent aspects, and the military aspect. So I thought I would start with the space that I think Lee-jung already kind of pioneered and talked about a bit. But just let's focus on the non-kinetic part first. I think it's fair to say that probably this is China's preferred approach, right? You know, China would love to have Taiwan fall into its lap without having to fight for it. I'm sure they were drooling at the prospect in the last election when one of the candidates, not the one who eventually ran on the KMT's ticket, certainly not the president, but when Ms. Hong Xiu-ju said that she had a very, very divergent perspective on Taiwan's identity and cross-strait relations. I think that may be something that Dr. Lai was hinting at. And I think that Beijing continues to hope that although it is increasing its ability to coerce Taiwan in a multispectral way, it has not fully given up hope that it can achieve through the ballot box or through domestic means inside of Taiwan that which it would prefer not to have to achieve by crossing the strait with military forces. And that means Beijing likes cat's paws, people who will do its bidding. It likes fellow travelers, people who think, you know, ultimately I owe some debt of responsibility to the Yellow Emperor and we're all sons and daughters of Xu and Yan and whatnot, or to useful idiots who don't know anything about China and think that it's okay to try and assume leadership of Taiwan without, or to run in Taiwan politics for important positions, without informing themselves in any meaningful way about the threat that China poses to Taiwan. And of course, Beijing also welcomes opportunists, people who think, well, you know, whatever happens, ultimately, I can profit off of this, and maybe it'll happen later, and I won't be responsible, or I'll be passed from the scene. And then I think a final category that Beijing finds useful in Taiwan are low information voters, people who don't pay attention to politics, people who say, I just want to go about my daily life. And of course, that's fair. No one is requiring anyone in any society to pay attention. But in an environment where an existential threat to your security and well-being is posed, it probably behooves most people in most societies, and especially in Taiwan, to pay very close attention to what China is doing. So what has China been doing? Well, I think Dr. Lai mentioned some of China's non-kinetic steps already, right? We've seen a very substantial effort to invite people from Taiwan over to China and woo them with the impression that China is the way of the future. China is a land of unlimited opportunities. And some of those opportunities are relatively recent, right? Taiwan has been offered 31 special measures from China in the last year and a half, where basically, if you're from Taiwan, you can enjoy preferential opportunities for economic development and personal growth if you come to China. And that's an attempt to use brain drain and to shift people's calculus of where their values and where their interests lie. And China has also used sticks, cutting off certain markets to Taiwan's exports, or trying to threaten Taiwan businesses that might invest in China, that if you don't go home and biao tai, if you don't go back to Taiwan and speak up on behalf of the 1992 consensus or the notion that the two sides of the strait are both ultimately one country, then your business in China might suffer. China also is quite sophisticated about leveraging openings in Taiwan's media landscape. And I think we've heard about this a bit, but it just bears saying that in an era when media outlets are all seeking any and every means to survive, advertising dollars are extremely rare, and China can provide a lot of them. And also providing access to the Chinese market for advertising by air or by television, if possible, is also a very valuable way for China to shape the incentive structures facing Taiwan's media outlets. Another way China has been pursuing this, of course, is international isolation. We've already heard Taiwan's a brief discussion of the importance from the Vice Minister of trying to hold on to Taiwan's diplomatic partners. And if I may make a brief intervention on behalf of the argument that Taiwan's diplomatic partners are not allies. Allies are countries that will come to your defense and that owe you something. Taiwan has 17 diplomatic partners. The United States was at one time both a diplomatic partner of Taiwan and an ally that was committed to the defense of Taiwan. Unfortunately, Taiwan today does not have any formal diplomatic allies, but it can, in all likelihood, thanks in large part to the U.S. Congress and the recognition by the broad national security establishment in the United States, count on the United States to come to Taiwan's defense. Hopefully that will not happen, because provided we do the right things, we can help Taiwan defend itself in such a way that Beijing will be deterred before it ever gets to that point. Finally, there has been a substantial effort by China in the non-kinetic space to engage in public opinion or psychological warfare to convince Taiwanese people that there is no future in Taiwan, that Taiwan is a guidao, an island with no future, of just an island of ghosts, if you will, where people can wander around just before or after they die, I guess probably after, to engage in subversion, whether that's through criminal networks in Taiwan, or actors who might pass information, and to substantially spread disinformation via social media. Disinformation that suggests that the government of Taiwan is abandoning traditional values that people might still hold dear, or is planning to do things in the policy space that will be detrimental to Taiwan voters, for example, by exaggerating the impact, the timing, or other aspects of the pension reform issue that was passed through last year. But I think it's fair to say that while China would love to have Taiwan fall into its lap and hopes to be able to weaken Taiwan, it probably does not expect ultimately that unless it gets lucky, it can actually do that. And so there is an interaction here between the non-kinetic elements of China's strategy towards Taiwan and the kinetic elements. You already heard from the Vice Minister. One of the things that the PLA has been doing has been encircling flights and driving ships and surface action groups out past Taiwan to show that the PLA Navy can now operate to the east of Taiwan, areas where Taiwan traditionally did not have to expect or anticipate a threat coming from China. Now, carrier-based aircraft might come towards Taiwan from the east, not only from across the strait. And the more that China operates in and around Taiwan, around Taiwan, the more it can desensitize Taiwan's military and the Taiwan population to the presence of the PLA. And in desensitizing, it can take away the ability for intelligence services to detect indicators and warnings that an attack might be imminent. Well, is this an attack? No, they do this every fall. They're always out sailing that way, but this time maybe they actually are preparing something. The question in the kinetic realm is, or a question in the kinetic realm is, how big a roll of the dice is China prepared to make? And what threat should and is Taiwan willing to prepare against? There's basically, I think, in the security space, about three big types of militarized exchanges or policy choices Beijing has to make. First, it can go at the relatively lower end. It could announce a blockade. Doesn't necessarily even have to shoot anything. can just announce it, and that could have an enormous effect on morale in Taiwan. Will countries or will private companies run a blockade? In such an event that China were to use a blockade, the PLA Navy, the PLA Air Force, possibly the PLA Rocket Force would be some of the key actors there. Another level up, if China wants to really roll the dice a bit more, is to engage in a punitive strike. And here you could imagine varieties of this, right? One would be kind of the lower grade version of what China did to Vietnam in 1979, a limited invasion, an attack on one of the offshore islands or on Taiping Dao, or something that is actually on Taiwan but is not intended to be the signal that a full-scale war has now been launched and that China is preparing an active invasion. And again, here the PLA Air Force, the PLA Rocket Force, and possibly a PLA's new strategic support force, which can carry out cyber attacks, might be important here. The final possibility is kind of often described as kind of the nightmare scenario. It's also the most challenging for China, and that would be to launch a full-on amphibious invasion, airborne assault, attempting to decapitate the regime in Taiwan, attempting to seize Taipei, defeat the ROC's air, naval, and ground forces, occupy and completely defeat and destroy the Republic of China. A mission Beijing claims to believe it did back in the late 1940s, but obviously has not fully succeeded at yet. This would involve all services of the PLA, all of the military capabilities, including its nuclear forces for deterrence to try to dissuade the United States from getting involved, to try to signal to the United States potentially that if you don't involve yourself in this fight, this is a fight within the family, so to speak, and so if you just stay out, this will not involve you and you won't have to absorb any losses. Fortunately, Taiwan has been shifting over the last couple of years away from what previously was kind of a misguided attempt to match China more symmetrically. So you can think Taiwan has 24 million people and a defense budget of about $10 billion a year, that China has about 1.3 billion people, a 2 million person military, and a defense budget in the open sources estimated in the $175 to $200 billion range. It's very, very challenging to do what China has to do, but China has growing resources and more advanced capabilities, and it does not face yet any of the demographic challenges that are also increasingly afflicting Taiwan. And as Michael Cole, one of the best analysts, I think, out there on Taiwan would say, if you look at the morale issue, China has effectively built up a narrative that military service, a militarized nation, is a strong nation. That's what you should be proud of. And it has inculcated a bit of this real aggressive nationalism. By contrast, Taiwan is exactly what you would hope a liberal democracy would achieve. Society will defend itself. People are firm about their belief in the values of their society, but they're not aggressive. They're not irrational. They're not out there being extremely violent. With that said, Taiwan has fortunately shifted in recognition of the China threat away from this kind of static one-to-one, China gets an aircraft carrier, so we'll build some more ships, towards a much more dynamic, survivable, lethal, agile force under its new overall defense concept. This is a strategy that attempts to be much more asymmetric, that attempts to not tie itself to big vulnerable things like airfields that don't move and are hard to defend, or big ports where where those ships have to come back to, but instead to leverage things that are smaller and more mobile. So, for example, it privileges truck-based anti-ship cruise missiles. It favors shore defenses to destroy any PLA invasion force. It favors mines to slow down any amphibious assault as those ships might pull towards the Taiwan coastline. It favors helicopters that could launch anti-tank missiles to destroy landing craft as they attempt to seize a beach, and fast attack missile boats. Some of these, I should say, are programs that have existed before and have gotten a plus up. Many of them are newer or are receiving greater attention. And of course, Taiwan is also pursuing some approaches that are still relatively more symmetric and relatively less survivable. For example, investing $1 billion in the next generation fighter trainer jet. That's a platform that's not going to be militarily usable in an actual conflict, although of course you do have to train your pilots. So too, the argument that Taiwan needs submarines is one that has sometimes been framed around Taiwan needs submarines. Okay, what kind of submarines do you need? I had the opportunity to pose this question to a Taiwanese interlocutor at one point and said, wouldn't Taiwan be better with a larger number of relatively smaller submarines? An argument that's been made most notably by some researchers here in Washington, D.C. at the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments. And the answer that I received back was not an operationally logical answer. It was not, those don't work so well in the waters around Taiwan, or they can't carry enough missiles. It was, Taiwan is not North Korea. It was a political and an image and an identity answer. An operational answer is fine, but an answer that says, well, we don't want to be seen as North Korea. Well, as someone who thinks about the U.S.-North Korea military balance, I'll tell you, those are a real problem. As someone who looks at South Korea a lot, I'll tell you, South Korea lost a naval corvette in 2010 to one of those mini-subs. They can certainly be quite lethal. And in terms of stopping the PLA, they can be quite valuable. So finally, I'd like to just lay out some questions that I think it might be useful for this audience to take away as they think about, what questions need to be answered as Taiwan thinks about where its defense strategy is going to go. First is, what level of contributions are you prepared to ask of the Taiwan people? Today, Taiwan is moving towards a volunteer force. It's not fully there yet. Are you prepared to tell the people of Taiwan that China is a military threat, possibly an existential military threat? I think the best case for this is what's happening in Xinjiang, where there are concentration camps, and in Hong Kong, which is seeing what happens when Chinese promises are allowed to govern. We in the United States, after 9/11, you probably remember if you were there, the president didn't ask much of the American people. He said, go out and go shopping. We've had times when other American presidents have not done much to ask the American people to contribute. But Taiwan is in a situation now where it probably needs to clarify to the people of Taiwan that there is a serious challenge and that all of Taiwan society needs to pull together and contribute. What kind of trade-offs is Taiwan willing to make between interests in the defense industrial sector and the autonomy that can bring, the ability to survive if even the United States were to one day cut off trade with Taiwan in military goods, versus the higher cost of producing indigenously, the longer time frames, and the probably lower battle effectiveness of relatively unproven systems. And of course, there's a politics to arms purchases in Taiwan, where if a Taiwan administration can say, look, we got the Americans to run a challenge with Beijing to show that the Americans really are committed, even though they know Beijing will be unhappy about this. And there's also the fact that it's easy to point to some of the things Taiwan would like to get are big, shiny things that show up well on evening news. Not so well if you can say, we invested $1 billion in upgrading our communications links, our tactical data systems. That doesn't show as well. Can Taiwan transform its domestic identity consensus, which is growing, that people in Taiwan say, first and foremost, I'm Taiwanese. I am a person of Taiwan. I may have ancestors who come from China, and my parents or my grandparents certainly would have said I'm Chinese, and my parents might have said I'm Chinese and I'm Taiwanese. But by the third generation, all you've known is Taiwan. I mean, my grandfather came from Vienna in 1914. I don't think of myself as Austrian in any meaningful way, not at all. I think that's a natural phenomenon over time. This is all I've ever known, and it's all most people in Taiwan have ever known is, Taiwan is my home. And that's a powerful message, but it's a message that also can carry consequences for Beijing. Beijing is watching and knows that the consensus in Taiwan over Taiwan's identity is increasingly pulling Taiwan away from a posture where Beijing might be able to woo a generation of younger Taiwan voters to think, oh yeah, ultimately I'm Chinese. So what does the timeline look like? Another very, very critical question. You know, a few years ago, many of you may remember, there was a discussion, is China going to invade Taiwan in 2020 or 2021? Well, if that's the case, do we see Taiwan, even under a DPP administration that's been much more savvy? I mean, I can remember Michael and his colleagues coming to visit us at RAND in the 2010-2011 timeframe, trying to get the DPP really smart on defense issues. But even under a DPP administration that has prioritized Taiwan's national security more, do we see a Taiwan society today that looks like it's prepared for war 6 months from now, or even 18 months from now? If the threat is as close as that, then Taiwan needs to be running kind of all out right now. If the threat is 5 years off, then now is exactly the right time to really be spinning up. If the threat's 10 years off, then maybe you got 5 years to get it all straightened out, get all your ducks in a row, and then start producing the hell out of some very asymmetric systems. What does that discussion about Taiwan's identity do to Xi Jinping and China's calculus? Does China think, okay, operationally, time's on our side? Beijing thinks, economically, operationally, the gap between the ROC armed forces and the PLA is only growing. The influence China can command, perhaps with its economy over Taiwan, is only growing. But on the other hand, if Beijing is more worried about what do we do if we invade, what do we do afterwards when we now own a nation of 24 million angry people who don't feel like they're Chinese and feel like they're occupied, they're being occupied. This has been Taiwan's experience before in the late 1940s. It took 4.5 decades of white terror, and it still ended up the authoritarian regime fell. The United States has had its own difficult experiences. We didn't try and colonize or occupy either Iraq or Afghanistan. But 24 million person countries, if they have some substantial subset of the population that's willing to fight, can put up a real difficult challenge for a military, even one as capable as the United States military, which is far more capable than the PLA. What kind of domestic pressures is Xi Jinping operating under? This could be a real wild card. It may have nothing to do with what Taiwan is thinking about, and it's not within the control of Taiwan or the United States. How much risk is Xi Jinping willing to absorb? How much risk is the CCP willing to absorb? Final questions, I think. What kinds of military technologies might lie on the horizon that could rebalance the situation? If directed energy weapons become a real phenomenon that's feasible, then it will be much more challenging for China to continue to effectively use its large portfolio of surface-to-surface short-range ballistic missiles. It will be much more challenging for China's advanced air fighters and bombers to deliver munitions if Taiwan can have ground-based defenses that operate at the speed of light. If that's truly a feasible technology, and it's not clear yet if it is, but there are, you can imagine things that could change Taiwan's situation, which certainly looks potentially grim operationally right now, but may not be so forever. Another question, I think, if war does come, which domain is the most important? Is it fighting out in the strait? Is it attriting those naval platforms and airships as they try to fly people and sail people and hardware over to Taiwan? Or is the fight primarily going to be at the beaches? Or is the fight primarily in the heads of the people of Taiwan, their will to stand up to Chinese pressure, their cohesiveness as a military and a society in the face of that threat? And finally, and this is the one where I want to end, what role will the United States continue to play in relation to our friends and partners in Taiwan? Will the United States continue to support Taiwan's legitimate defense needs? Will it continue to plan to deter and, if necessary, defeat the Chinese armed forces? Will the United States be led in such a way that we can effectively bring along allies and partners who share our values and convince them that if this fight were to occur, it is the critical fight for the security of the Asia-Pacific and the future of the Indo-Pacific? Will we be able to bring along, in other words, Japan, Australia, our allies in NATO? Or will the United States either cede the field or respond slowly without determination. I don't think that's the case. I think Walter knows better than most probably. The Congress has the interests of Taiwan in mind almost all the time. The Taiwan Relations Act is an enormous source of pride for the Congress and should be for every administration. And I will say for the current U.S. administration, there are an enormous number of friends in high places who have focused on Taiwan's security and the threat posed by the People's Republic of China to both Taiwan and the United States for many years. And so the challenge is to both convince the head of the current administration that traditional values are sometimes right for a reason, and to convince any successor U.S. administration that not everything this current administration did should be tossed, even if it's of a different party. So I'll end there. Thank you so much, Walter.
Great, thank you. That was terrific, both of you. I wanted to come back to this issue that I asked the Deputy Foreign Minister, Szu-chien, about your diplomatic allies, about Taiwan's diplomatic allies, because both of you touched on it a little bit. It's fair to say you're absolutely right. They are not allies. They are countries that recognize Taiwan as opposed to the PRC. Although I guess when you have no allies, you're a little bit flexible in what you choose to call an ally. But you could argue that, you know, the most important relationships, well, I mean, I think you would argue the most important relationships are with the United States and Japan and Australia and even some European countries, much more important than Solomon Islands or some others. And I could understand Szu-chien has a role to play, right? You've got some countries that are maybe on the cusp, Solomon Islands being one of them, and you don't want to give a signal that, well, we don't really care about this. But there is some question, and you also mentioned Michael Cole, and he's someone who made me think about this the most, I think, is how much value really is there? And ought Taiwan be planning for the eventuality that all of these allies will eventually leave? So could each of you comment on that too? What exactly is the value, and how do you measure that value of these diplomatic relationships? How do you measure them against other priorities in Taiwan's diplomatic outlook?
Go first and then
Okay. If that's your preference, I'm happy to. I think that the diplomatic partnerships that Taiwan has, first it must be said, many of Taiwan's diplomatic partners recognize Taiwan. Some of them recognize Taiwan for the right reasons. Oftentimes, they are encouraged to do so with what the minister noted, assistance and aid programs, which are very, very generous. Taiwan is very generous, but its generosity is towards an end. It's a very legitimate end, and that is to retain recognition. There is a narrative in Taiwan society, and I have heard it previously from unnamed Taiwan officials, that there is an inordinate effort by many of Taiwan's diplomatic partners to extract value from Taiwan. They know what situation Taiwan is in, and this is the real world, and we all know that countries follow their interests and rarely do things purely out of the goodness of the right values that they would like to see. So there is, I think, it oversells Taiwan's diplomatic partners to call them allies. With that said, they do have value. So they speak up for Taiwan in international society. There is an enormously important morale boost to having some countries continue to recognize the ROC. It's an important opportunity for Taiwan to have diplomats to go abroad and have ambassadorships, and if there are none, especially if Taiwan were to lose all of its South America, Latin America, and Caribbean diplomatic partnerships. Taiwan currently engages in what's called stopover diplomacy. So Presidents Hai or other leaders might come through the United States for refueling on their way to South America. That's a very useful pretext. I mean, the United States could, of course, invite or permit a Taiwan leader to come at any time. But we've kind of maintained this fiction, and it's useful to have those diplomatic partners there for that. Of course, on the opposite side, if Taiwan were to lose all of them, this will give substantial support to those in Taiwan who say, look, at the end of the day, we've always been a different country than China. We had a different experience under the Qing dynasty, which was a Manchu dynasty. It was not China. Remember, China was a colony of the Manchus at the time, and we had a different experience under Japan. And now the scab has been ripped off, and if we literally have none, then great. Let's establish ourselves as the Republic of Taiwan, and let's ask the world to recognize us. And Beijing could treat that as a casus belli. It's not to say that it's the wrong thing to do necessarily. Taiwan gets to choose, and Taiwan has to accept some risk with choice. But that could be one of the consequences. And Beijing, I think, could conceivably be pushing it in that direction, perhaps even deliberately, thinking, once Taiwan is forced to make this choice, it probably will make it, and Beijing likes psychological warfare and likes to be able to frame questions this way. Taiwan was being provocative, we're just forced to respond. No country in the world recognizes Taiwan, so no country in the world can legitimately respond if we use force within our territory. I think that's some of the value there. But for sure, Walter, you're right. I mean, the most important relationships Taiwan has, first of all, are with its own people, its democracy. That is Michael's point, I think, is its greatest strength is its people and its values. Second is with the United States. Third is Japan, and then other countries out from there.
Yeah. Of course, I think that sometimes you compare with those smaller states of Taiwan diplomatic partnership, official diplomatic partnership with the stronger country like United States, Japan, India, and Australia. It's a little bit unfair comparison. But I tended to look at this in terms of some of the operational advantage that those diplomatic, not ally, but partners, they can provide to Taiwan. I just gave some example because none of them has been widely discussed, but it was employed in Taiwan. Taiwan is not, we just cannot enter United Nations. But our diplomatic partners, they are part of the UN. And for some of the UN meeting, it's actually that we are able to go through our diplomatic partners, so to have our people to be able to witness and experience what the UN and its operations all about, and sometimes even help them to write something they deem that's important to them, but also help us to gain the experience. So that's one thing. And it happened in some of the smaller Pacific Island states, especially when you, I think this experience and expertise, sometimes that's very important. When you look at Taiwan, the diplomat in Taiwan, they have the experience in the UN, retired in year 2003. So right now, from year 2000 onward, our whole diplomats, we have a whole diplomat group that have zero experience in any kind of those important international multilateral meetings. And not to speak about the kind of network as well as the resources and also the international operational norm associated with it. And if you look at many of the younger Taiwan diplomats, they probably have very little experience in the so-called real multilateral organization and networking and operations. Many of them, they just tended to look at the bilateral relationship. So there's a big lack of experience in that area. And for that, the diplomatic partners, they provide the vehicle for us to get on board. Of course, that does not mean that other countries, they are so irreplaceable that they can only fill the function. If, for example, United States or Japan or other countries is willing to give, for example, our youngsters the kind of intern for them to be part of the UN missions, and then for them to understand how this is actually working, and also to get the personal those feeling about what the norm should be all about. That could also be helpful. Another thing is that those diplomatic partners, they also provide another pretext in addition to the so-called stopover diplomacy. Those diplomatic partners, they are eligible to invite other countries' leaders or the diplomats or senior officials to participate in certain meetings. How about our foreign minister? If he wanted to meet some of the country's leader, and he needs to meet with him or her to discuss certain things. our diplomatic partners, the location and how they, as a mediator, to initiate the platform for the dialogue. That sometimes is important to us. And also, our diplomatic partners could help us to initiate a certain multilateral forum in which that will boost our international networking and contact with other countries that usually we just cannot get in touch with. Okay, so the loss of diplomatic partners did operationally will cause some of the inconvenience as well as more complexity and difficulty for our multilateral as well as the bilateral engagement with other countries, which we normally just cannot be able to associate with. Many of those bilateral relations, if you look at Taiwan diplomacy, we had to go through various very difficult and strange unofficial channels, and that also put Taiwan to be suspected of the international hackings of some of the people. They are just try to hack Taiwan for because I know you have the need for those engagements, so I'm going to charge you more. So those are the things that if you sit on the bench and in Taiwan, look at all the diplomatic operations, those diplomatic, I'll say allies now, did provide some of these things that's needed for us.
It's very thorough thinking through of that. Is it any other questions? Let me get this gentleman down front.
Hi. My name is Eric, and I'm with Project 2049. And I had a question about disinformation. I mean, Scott, you mentioned social media. I think it's pretty rampant, circular reporting. There's traditional media and the whole media landscape in general. Undoubtedly, it's going to step up with elections coming up as well. And my question is, with the noted PLA involvement and this whole of government, state, party, military-directed political warfare, what can the United States and what can Taiwan do to counter disinformation within the media landscape? Not just responding to individual cases, but from an organizational perspective. Like what organizations should we be looking out for? Where is it coming from, and how do we combat it in general?
So it's an extremely difficult question, and I think it's evident from our last election and the period that we've had since then that the United States is itself still grappling with this, as are many European countries, as is Australia, as is New Zealand, not all with respect to the same country. Us with Russia, Europeans with Russia, New Zealand, Australia, Taiwan, more with China. I think it's helpful to disaggregate this into a number of discrete avenues to think about. One is raising public awareness and building public consensus that this is a real issue. It's not something where the government's making it up or an opposition party that lost an election is just engaging in sour grapes. Another approach may be legislative. I will say I've talked to people in Taiwan who say, and I think you heard it from the vice minister today, there's a discussion about the law, but there's also a fear, especially for this government, I think, because this is the government of the party that struggled for and helped with Taiwan society's support to build and force democratization in Taiwan. And there's a feeling of, we can't betray our legacy. We can't go back. We'll be accused of being authoritarian or high-handed or heavy-handed or whatever. And I think, the correct response to that may be something like, look, in the United States, you can't yell fire in a crowded theater. In Germany, you can't advocate Nazism. In South Korea, I think that's still true today in South Korea, you can't openly advocate for North Korea and unification under North Korea. So I think there are ways that free societies that want to defend themselves and are threatened by authoritarian societies that are happy to use their freedoms against them can do so, but it requires running a bit of political cost. There may be technology angles where using AI to identify fakes or to quickly flag to people that this this story has already been debunked, and if it shows up in your Line feed or you see it on PTT, it's not, it's not true. There is a role for Taiwan civil society, which is quite strong, although it's the actors in Taiwan civil society that are working in this space are quite small and underfunded. There are probably other ways. I'm sure intelligence sharing. There is I think the government of Taiwan has a fairly rapid response. In fact, I will tell you, if you talk to Taiwan government officials, you'll hear a number of different timelines along which they have to respond. Anything less than 48 hours is too late. Anything less than 48 hours, you've got to do it in 20 hours. 12 hours. The news cycle in Taiwan is 6 hours. It's like you get down to, like, if we haven't responded by the time, the second person pushes it off their Twitter feed or whatever, it's too late. I think the reality is, by the time it enters the mainstream media, which is where kind of social media pushes the traditional media landscape, by the time it's being discussed on traditional media, it probably has already circulated long enough. But some of the technologies are also important there. Some are closed discussion groups, and some of them are open. You can think here, if I have to invite the 25 people in this room to discuss it, and it doesn't spread outside of the 25 people in this room, well, sorry, all of you are important people in Washington, D.C., I'm sure, but if you want to affect this country, you got to spread it to, a few million people. And it's a bit akin to a virus. If a virus is extremely lethal and burns itself out quickly, or it saturates the people who will believe it but doesn't spread out and gain legitimacy, then it's not so effective. Whereas if it spreads on a bigger platform, it can be more so.
Yeah, I would say that definitely the intelligence sharing is very important. And I personally believe that if we do believe that Chinese influence operation, not just on Taiwan, but also on other countries, that is the global phenomenon that we need to collectively deal with it. First of all, the Five Eyes need to have a set mechanism how to communicate with each other and to address this Chinese intelligence operation. And also those five, probably we need to wider dialogue with by inviting Taiwan as well as Japan. Japan seems to be a little bit successful story in countering those. But there's also India, which is also at the beginning of, could be bombarded, but could also have a way to deal with it. Like those countries altogether, at least we can discuss and share our experience. Another thing about it is that when we talk about the social media and the traditional media, first about social media, yes, Scott is correct that many of the fake news or those rumors, they first echo within this closed group, and then through those closed groups started to spread out to others. Then our problem about dealing with the issue of the fake account, especially in the social media, is that none of them, those social media company is willing to have a real dialogue with Taiwan. Line Group, for example, Line is very important vehicle in the social media, especially from those about the fake news. But we were able to get to the Line agreeing to set up a fact check portion of it, but then it's so reactive and not being very proactive in dealing with things. And also, how about the fake accounts in the Facebook? About Chinese, will Facebook deal with those? And when we talk to them, are they going to deal with it? And I think for the United States, some of the companies, they are located, they're US company or Japanese company. I think that foreign government, they can communicate with us, especially on this part, how to really get the foreign, those social media corporate vehicles to really be on board as partners to fight against the fake news. And right now, it hasn't happened yet. And the third thing about the mainstream newspapers, yes, it is true, in my view, that 75% of our print as well as electronic media right now is either under direct Chinese influence or strong Chinese influence. But the thing is that we just cannot treat those Taiwan media environment as this is a free market, because we do know that China provide free film, free images and everything to a certain Taiwan TV stations in order to boost their competitiveness in Taiwan. And also know that China was able to, through their advertisement deal way back in China, through Taiwan businessmen, to help a certain Taiwan TV station and to fight against others, TV station or the newspaper that do not agree with them. So that I think right now the issue is how are able to involve the international forces in here and try to rebalance it. And another thing is that we do notice that like Financial Times as well as Nikkei as New York Times, they started to have their own Chinese, the English as well as Chinese versions. And how are you able to amplify and get those and let them play a bigger role in terms of the reporting to balance against the Chinese propagandas? That is another important vehicle probably we could explore.
Great, thank you. Well, please join me in thanking both our panelists for their terrific discussion. And this adjourns the program. Thank you very much.